Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 143. A publisher spotlight on Retrofit Big Planet Comics.
Countdown for blast off. X-5, 4, 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to be doing another publisher spotlight. This time, we're going to be looking specifically at Retrofit Comics, Big Planet Comics, and they have a lot of books that have come out this year. But before we get to a discussion of those, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find incredible specials, and July is no exception. Sometimes you're going to find those specials at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover price, but many times the discounts go higher from there.
That's right, and this month they have a load of bundles that you can take advantage of where you can get multiple comics from the same publisher for a deeper discount than you might get if you bought those comics individually. And this month they have a bunch of bundles from DC Comics for new, returning, and continuing series, as well as their kids' books and Vertigo, and Marvel bundles, and as usual the Valiant bundle where you buy all 8 of the newest Valiant issues. You get them for 50% off.
That's right. You cannot go wrong by visiting the website of Discount Comic Book Service and see what kind of specials they got going on this month. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to drop them a line and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, we have a lot going on this episode. In fact, the Retrofit Comics, Big Planet Comics, and they're basically two different organizations that publish together now, as they have for the past few years. So there's a lot that we're going to be discussing, and we're going to be focusing primarily on their releases from 2015. And we'll get to those in a moment, but before that, we have some thank yous to go around. First and foremost, we want to welcome two brand new podcast patrons to the Comics Alternative family. Art Boucher is now a podcast patron, as is Pratik Thomas. So in the past week or so, both Art and Pratik have become podcast patrons of the Comics Alternative. That means that they support us for at least $5 a month. and we very much appreciate that. They join the noble ranks of Daniel White, Christopher Michael, Paul Lay, Salgood Sam, Michael Norhale, Tom Matthews, Don Witzel, Simon Brilsby, David Campbell, and Raider Koshnick.
That's right. We're rapidly approaching our first goal, aren't we?
Are we? I haven't. What is our first goal? I haven't looked.
At $100.
We're getting close.
Yeah, we're at $90 a month now, so we're just 10 small dollars away from having that $100 per month goal, where we'll be able to more comfortably meet the basic costs of the podcast.
That's right. So maybe next week we'll get 2 more podcast patrons, and we'll be there.
That's right.
And you know what this means in terms of comfortably, or making things more comfortable for us in terms of our costs. I mean, there's the normal kind of everyday, so to speak, costs of running a podcast. But then there are other things that come up. For instance, a couple weeks ago, Andy, you and I and Andy Wolverton were at Heroes Con. Well, we used Comics Alternative funds for about everything that we did there, buying space at the con in Artist Alley, the table covering, the banner that we used, little things like that. Mm-hmm. So it does go a long way, and it makes things a lot more comfortable for us if we don't have to do it out of pocket as much.
Yeah, and we paid for our own transportation and things like and room and board if we needed to, but. Yeah, so the kind of basic Comics Alternative stuff with the table and the decorations and so on was definitely coming from that. And I always thought that more comfortably meet the cost of the podcast meant a massage chair for me. I want to be more comfortable.
Well, maybe
while I do the podcast and get that going.
Maybe after a few more podcast patrons, then you'll be able to get that.
We should put that down when we hit like $2,000 a month.
Yeah, although the hum of the massage chair cannot be heard on your mic, so you're going to have to rig up something special for that.
Okay, then maybe more than $2,000.
Okay. So anyway, thank you guys for being podcast patrons. We appreciate your support.
Yes.
You know, Andy, we also appreciate the support of those who have left us ratings and reviews on iTunes. And, you know, I've been a little remiss in keeping up with the ratings and comments that we've had over the past few months. And I want to mention just a few that have come out over the past, 3-4 months. Rick Granger writes in his iTunes review, while I usually enjoy the interviews of various independent comics creators, I was especially impressed by the recent review with the creators of The Humans due to the samples of Humans-related original music aired during the interview. Awesome.
That's great.
Yeah, that was a fun interview, and with Tom Neely and Keenan Keller, the most fucks, I think, that have ever been mentioned in a Comics Alternative episode.
At least on air.
On air, yes. Yeah. Also, I am
when we had Scott McCloud on after the show, he ran a blue streak.
Luckily, the mics were cut off.
I'm just kidding. He didn't do that.
We also have a comment from someone by the name of I Am a Target Market. Okay, that's one word. Having only seriously gotten into comics in the last 6 months or so, I've been a dabbler for years, this has been the absolute best podcast for discovering great titles and creators. The primary hosts, Andy and Derek, are both very well-read, knowledgeable, and passionate about the art and craft of comics. They are also likable and positive without being too cutesy. Oh, that's good. Their tastes are wide-ranging and eclectic, spanning from the highbrow to the and respectable to the crass and ridiculous. And you know, we're all about crass and ridiculous. They focus on discussing and critiquing stuff that they actually like, wasting no time on comics that hold no appeal for them. They also have very distinct and different voices that were just made for radio or podcasting. That's a great compliment as well. Start with
that is a nice compliment.
Yeah, start with any of the preview catalog episodes to get a good taste, as they always cover a lot of ground there. The occasional alternate hosts are always a pleasure too. Great work, guys.
Well, that's really nice, and the yet another comment about the previews episodes that I mentioned on the last time we did the previews episode, that I heard at Heroes Con, several people saying that they really like the previews episodes, which, you know, makes that a little bit of an easier job to do, since that is those have been our marathon episodes of late. But also the comment about our voices, I think, is particularly timely for me, because I have just been listening to the podcast a lot more now that I have, as I mentioned on the last episode, started my new job. That means I have to drive to work every 5 days a week. And so I've been listening to the podcast more, and there were two things that started driving me nuts as I was listening to the podcast. The first was when we did the live shows at Heroes Con.
Mm-hmm.
I hate my laugh. Like, for some reason on that, I sound like an idiot laughing. Like this.
Okay, now that sounded like an idiot laugh, but I
wasn't even trying to make a fake laugh. That was my normal laugh. So I was listening, and I was like, geez, I hope this guy doesn't laugh again. And then on other episodes, I've started to kind of, I think, self-consciously hear myself breathe.
Mm-hmm.
So I gotta be careful about that. Maybe hold my breath a little more.
Well, not so much that, or maybe move the mic a little further from your mouth.
Yeah, I was going for this kind of Janet Jackson thing, you know, where I have the mic right in front of my face, so I can move around and, you know.
Okay, as long as you don't have your wife rip off your top and you have a wardrobe malfunction.
Yeah.
At least while we're podcasting.
I'll try to avoid that.
And that's an image I've got to get out of my head now.
Yeah, work on getting rid of that.
Yeah. So anyway, we want to thank those guys for their very kind and detailed comments that they left on iTunes. And you know, it's great to get these kind of comments on iTunes and elsewhere. And in fact, on the topic of kind reviews, someone just today, and we're recording this on Sunday, July 5th, someone tweeted to someone else a recommendation about the Comics Alternative. I am loving the Comics Alternative podcast. The two guys with PhDs put together an intelligent, constructive show with massive indie comic support. So, and this was really cool. This came from James Burton, who is the guy behind Angry Brain Artworks, and you can check out his podcast or his website at angrybrainsartworks.com. So, thank you very much, James, for recommending the Comics Alternative.
Yes, thank you.
Well, Andy, we have a lot to discuss today, so you want to go ahead and get to our publisher spotlight.
Yeah, let's do it.
Now, before we get to a discussion of the titles proper, we want to let you guys listen to a very brief interview that I did with Box Brown, who is the publisher, editor, founder of Retrofit Comics. And we've done this, Andy, for the last two publisher spotlights we've done, and I know that you weren't a part of those, but we thought that we would do this as a little experiment, and it seems to be working well, where we will start off with what the publisher or the publicist would have to say about the press, kind of introducing it to the readers. And then after that, we get into a discussion of the titles themselves. And I had a good conversation with Box, so let's go ahead and give this a listen.
Yeah, let's listen to that.
I have the pleasure of having Box Brown, the publisher, founder, editor, and what have you of Retrofit Comics, which is the subject of this Publisher Spotlight. Box, thank you very much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Let's start with an introduction to Retrofit Comics and how you brought it about, and then its relationship with Big Planet Comics.
Okay, it sounds good to me.
So how did you start Retrofit?
Well, so I think 2011, I was self-publishing a series of comics that I was doing called Everything Dies. And I had my own subscribers, and I was, I think I put out like 4 issues a year. And that was like as much as I could do. And at some point I remember thinking, like, if I could just put out a comic every month and, publish it every month and just build a subscriber base, like, I think I could, like, make that into a functioning actual business. And I was like, I have a lot of friends who make comics, and look, we're all self-publishing, and we're all trying to distribute our own work in all these ways. And I was like, maybe I could, like, take on some of that work. And I just thought it would be a good idea. And ended up getting, sending some emails out to some of my friends and stuff that were working in comics and seeing if anyone was, just to gauge interest. I was trying to find, 12 people, because the idea was that it would, we'd do it for a year and release a comic every month. So I wanted to find 12 artists. And I ended up finding like 17 artists that wanted to be involved. And so we did this Kickstarter, and I ended up doing that first run of Retrofit 17 months in a row, all different, different artists, all by myself. And then the next year, I was like, that was too many comics to do by myself. So the next year, I was like going to do just 6 or 7. And even then, I didn't do a Kickstarter the second year, and I was just like trying to just do it on my own. But I ended up, pretty rough shape. I didn't think I was going to be able to finish the year. And I ended up, Jared Smith from Big Planet Comics, who was like just, selling Retrofit Comics, contacted me and was asking me for advice about getting into like publishing and who to what printers to use and how things work. How do you he wanted to know all about it, and because he wanted to get into the business. And it just kind of seemed like a perfect pairing, because I was like, I already got this whole publishing thing set up. But, at that time, like, we had been featured in Tumblr, and we had like a really large Tumblr following, and I had a pretty big subscriber base. All the stuff like I had built up, it would seem like a waste to just cancel it or to end it. Meanwhile, for Jared, like, to just start from nothing seemed silly. So I suggested that we partner up, and it ended up becoming really great for us, because now we have Jared runs one of the Big Planet Comics stores in the Washington, D.C. area. And they have 4 stores in the area, and they've been around for like 20-something years or whatever. So it's a good base to have. We can sell all of our books out of those stores. And so Jared also is like this business-minded individual who, which I am not. I am just an artist who thought I was doing, I was like, I know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, I was like running up printer bills and everything. but so Jared is like super smart and like knows how to is really good at focusing on the business aspects of things. And it allows me to just focus on like the creative aspects of Retrofit, like working with artists and editing books and doing layout, like it just all that stuff, that whole end of it. So now it's been going pretty good, and we're kind of self-sustaining and growing every day and trying to put out quality stuff.
So now, how long have you had the partnership with Jared and Big Planet?
Okay, so that started in 2013, I think. Midway through 2013.
So not that long at all.
No, not really.
Yeah. So do you feel that you've become more prolific as a publisher / editor since this partnership?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I just feel much better about the whole situation because I had no ability to deal with business at all, and like Jared is just like does all that now. So it's just, for me personally, it's been like a real weight off my shoulders, and Jared is much better at it too. Like when I was sending out books, they were like barely packaged at all. Jared makes sure everything is protected and everything comes nicely, and you get a nice package from Retrofit when you order stuff. And so, it just works better. It's better now. And it's just better when you have two people focused on the same goal rather than just one. You get more done, and we can grow in ways. Jared helps us grow in ways that I was unable to see or bring about.
Okay. Now, no need to go into detail about the various titles, but when it comes to those that you've put out in 2015, this year so far, many of the ones that we're going to be talking on this episode of the podcast, what can you tell us in a general sense about these titles? There's a wide variety of there. Does this kind of mark where you see Retrofit being right now?
Yeah, I think so. I think this year and this year I think I had a really good vision for what I wanted. I always plan it by year, and I always try to have a good mix of artists involved. And I was really happy with all the artists that we worked with this year and are working with this year, continue to work with, and setting up next year. And I think it's in the same vein, and it's always like slightly different because of the different mix of people. But I think every year we are working with the best, as I see it, the best artists out there.
Yeah, in addition to the variety of the different kinds of artists in terms of their style and their storytelling abilities, I mean, it's a nice mix. In looking at not only this year's titles, but also the ones that came out last year, there are a variety of names that I recognize, but many that this is my first exposure to. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you get those, like, for instance, Matt Madden or James Kachalka, who have done a lot of work in the past. At the same time, you're bringing in brand new folk.
Yeah. So that's like part of my philosophy, right? It's actually kind of based on pro wrestling. Because what they would do always, is have, you have the big star, and you use the big stars to put over the younger stars who people haven't really heard of, because they get, if you have Hulk Hogan out there and he is in the ring with Joe Schmo, you're going to remember Joe Schmo a little bit more. So one of the things I try to do when putting together like a year's worth of artists is have artists that have an established readership and have been around for a long time, and have that pair up with other artists who are new or don't have as much name recognition. And I think that helps the, Matt Madden has a history of quality, you know what I mean? Like, Matt Madden's gonna be putting out a good book. And I think that, maybe Laura Lana's people haven't really heard of as much as Matt Madden, but I think she's doing just really good work, just as good quality work as Matt Madden. And I think that helps people to, putting them all together like that helps people to it gives credibility to the younger artists that don't have as big of a following.
Now, how do you find some of these artists that, let's say, don't have that big of a following that most people may not know about?
I mean, this is just my personal, these are like my favorite artists, you know what I mean? So like these are people that I, as a fan of comics, that's how we all get started in this business, right? By being a fan of comics and by developing comic taste and all this stuff. And these are artists that I personally enjoy their work, and I think that they're doing vital work and interesting work. So if anything, there's any kind of like editorial, if there's anything I can do to put what we look for in words, it's just things that I like. It's the Box Brown. This is what the Box Brown library looks like, and the things that stand out to me as far as people working right now.
Well, what might we expect in the future from Retrofit Big Planet?
A lot more. We always shoot for a book every month, or at least average to a book every month. And I think next year we're going to be seeing more books that have spines, but also smaller works too, because that's where we started, and that's what part of the vision is, to keep that the small format, shorter work titles with staples in them. Mm-hmm. Always be an outlet for artists who want to work in that format.
In fact, on the topic of format, this is, again, where variety comes into play with Retrofit Big Planet. I mean, I'm looking at the ones that have come out this year, and, I mean, they're all over the place in terms of size. For instance, Niv Bavarsky, is that how you pronounce it? Niv's name? Piggy is something very much like a mini-comic. On the other hand, An Entity Observes All Things does have a bit of a spine there, so you would call this something more like a graphic novel. And then there are others that are more traditional comic book size with that staple in the middle right there. So are you going to continue to put out this variety of format?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're getting into comics, you don't, and you're getting into publishing, you don't realize how many options you actually have in terms of format, and you can really just do anything. And my philosophy on format is that it should be a size that helps the book, and presents the work in the book in the best possible light, rather than the work being forced into a standard format for any reason, Mm-hmm. Like if an artist wants to do a book that is big or is a weird size, like I'm totally fine with that, and I think that it should be the format is just another element that you can use to help push the vision of that particular work. And I want there to be, and I like there to be a variety in size. I feel like, if you just get, like, if every Retrofit comic, and this is how we started, was that they were all the same size, because it was just easier, you could predict what the pricing of each book would be easier. But now we are able to just let the format, or let the comic guide the format, rather than the format being just standard, and the comic fitting into the format.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there, a lot of difference, and a lot of comics. You put out a lot, and we're going to have a lot to discuss on this episode. So, Box, thank you again for taking the time to introduce our listeners to Retrofit Big Planet Comics.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So that was fun. I got a lot of information from Box about the genesis of Retrofit Comics and then its relationship with Big Planet Comics. And Andy, I have to tell you that I had to really restrain myself from asking him specifically about his work. In particular, Andre the Giant that came out last year. I asked nothing about that.
Right. Maybe we can have Box on the show another time to talk about his work, especially when he has another big book come out like Andre the Giant.
Oh, love to. Yep. But actually, Box has one of the 7 books that have come out this year from Retrofit Big Planet Comics. And let's go ahead and go over the titles real quick. And you and I were talking before we turned the recorder on. We really don't have a plan on how to organize our discussion of these books. We'll just get to them as they come up. In particular, the books that have come out this year in 2015 from Retrofit Big Planet have been in order of publication: Drawn Onward by Matt Madden, Mowgli's Mirror by O. Schwarben, Piggy by Niv Bavarsky, The Unmentionables by Jack Teagle, Sea Urchin by Laura Knetzer, An Entity Observes All Things, Box Brown, and then most recently, Ink for Beginners, A Comic Guide to Getting Tattooed by Kate Leth. Mm-hmm. So, Andy, where do you want to start?
Well, maybe as with a kind of broader question, what, after having looked at these 7 books, right, that have come out in last year, is there any kind of overall trends or themes or anything like that seem to tie what Retrofit Big Planet puts out?
For me, no, and that's what makes it distinctive. Now, unlike other publishers that we've looked at specifically for Publisher Spotlight episodes, recently, for instance, Ad House, Conundrum, you can pull back and look at not only their most recent seasonal releases, but also the other books that they've put out as well, and you can get a sense of the kind of books and the kind of creators they tend to put out. With Retrofit and Big Planet, I'm hard-pressed to point out the kind of comic that would make a distinctive, let's say, Retrofit Big Planet comic. In fact, that was even something, if you recall, that Box mentioned in that brief conversation I had with him. They seem to be all over the place. And one of the things that really impresses me about this publisher, or I guess publishers, is that you can have creators whose names that at least I would recognize. For instance, Matt Madden is a pretty big name in comics. And then last year, James Kachalka came out with a book that we can discuss later if you want, Fungus, The Unbearable Rottenness of Being. Right. And so those names are there alongside creators that I have never heard of before. For instance, I know that I looked up Jack Teagle and saw that he had done a number of things. For instance, his book Fight through No Brow, but I wasn't aware of his work before. I was definitely not aware of the work of Kate Leth, and then some of the others that we're going to discuss. So I think it's great that it's a mix of a variety of things. So the fact that it's difficult to put your finger on one kind of comic makes that a distinctive feature.
Yeah, I was familiar with Kate Leth's work, so when I saw that Ink for Beginners was included in the package we got, I was pretty excited to take a look at that book as well. And and you mentioned Matt Madden being one of the other well-known creators, and one of the other things I was thinking about as I read these books was in relationship to the regular annual podcast we do with the Best American Comics volumes. And I have a feeling we might see some of this stuff in the next volume or the one after that, depending, because of course we're talking about these 7 books, but Retrofit Big Planet very generously sent us a large box of stuff. And that includes other well-known creators, too, like Sam Alden, who was included in the last Best American Comics volume.
Right. Yeah. In fact, a little background on that. We should let our listeners know that earlier this year, we got in touch with Retrofit Big Planet to ask, for review copies of both Box Brown's and Entity Observes All Things, which at the time hadn't come out yet, and also O. Schwarben's Mowgli's Mirror. And then what we got was not just those two books, but what both Box and Jared Smith sent us was an entire package of releases. I think all of their 2014 books and then one book from 2013. So we could even comment on those as we go along. I mean, we've already brought up, for instance, Kalchaka and Alden's books that came out in 2014. So we thought after getting that big package that instead of doing a review of one or two of their titles, why don't we devote an entire publisher spotlight to Retrofit Big Planet?
Yeah.
Just makes sense. Well, let's. Now, you said you knew of Kate Leth's work before. What else has she done?
Oh boy, I knew you were going to ask that. Okay. I'm familiar, I believe, with her, with her Kate or Die series that she does. She does for Comics Alliance. We're a little slow on that, and on her own website, kateordiecomics.com.
Okay, because when I did read Ink for Beginners, a comic guide to getting tattooed, in those opening pages, I thought I recognized her art, but then I thought, well, maybe it's just one of those feelings that it's almost like deja vu. I think I've seen that somewhere before, or I've experienced this before, and maybe I have, or maybe not, but I wasn't familiar, at least consciously, with her work. So how would you explain or describe Ink for Beginners to our listeners?
What I find interesting about Ink for Beginners is that it fits into a kind of subgenre of nonfiction comics that we might call instructional comics. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more of these, it seems, coming out online, especially, but also I know people from there's the whole kind of conference associated with and movement of comics and medicine, where comic creators are teaming up with medical experts to create informational comics that help people through medical issues. Mm-hmm. And usually those works have this kind of narrator in the same way that Kate does, where she herself narrates the story. One of the other creators whose works I'm reminded of here too is Erica Moen. I don't know if you're familiar with Erica Moen's webcomics. She does a website. Now I'm going to try to remember the name of it. I think her webcomic is called Oh Boy Sex Toy. Okay. And where she reviews sex toys.
Oh, really?
On her in comics form.
Okay, yeah. You have my attention now.
And I got to know Erica Moen's work because she did Bucko with Jeff Parker, which was a webcomic that was hilarious a few years ago, just really, really over the top. And she had already had her own webcomic from that point on, but now her webcomic kind of presence has been focused in on Oh Joy. I said Oh Boy. It's Oh Joy Sex Toy, where she and her partner review various sex toys, and it's fun. And so and she has this kind of avatar of herself, and that kind of takes you through the instructions as well. So now that we went that route, we can go back to Ink for Beginners. So Kate Leth has her own Avatar, who is the narrator of this comic, and it goes through and gives you advice about. It's literally, a comic guide to getting tattooed, as the subtitle says, and it's a very helpful. I'll never get a tattoo. I'm just going to put that out there.
Okay.
I have enough. Nature has given me enough things on my skin that I don't need to have somebody else put things on.
Okay.
If that makes any sense.
I get where you're going.
You can draw the Liberty Bell on my back in freckles if you want, and connect the dots. But anyway, so Kate takes us through different questions people have about getting tattoos, and she herself has quite a few tattoos, and so she knows what she's talking about. And I think for somebody who was thinking about getting tattoos, especially a young person, because she does talk about what things you should keep in mind, especially if you're young, about the idea of the tattoo you want being permanent part of your body for the rest of your life. And so I think for anybody who was contemplating the idea of getting a tattoo, this would be helpful.
Oh, exactly. You mentioned that Kate has a number of tattoos. She tells us on the first page that she has around 30. Mm-hmm. And you're right, much of this book, and it's a short comic, almost in mini comic form, or it is in mini comic form. It's based around a series of questions such as, does it hurt? Should I tip my artist? Where on the body should I get the tattoo, and how does it feel? Little things like that. I really appreciate the way that she's structured this kind of expository comic. And you mentioned that she is also giving advice to younger readers who may not, I don't know, maybe think clearly or rationally about what they're doing, maybe act impulsively. I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I really liked about Ink for Beginners and respect about Kate Leth is the fact that she risks, I think, coming across as a quote-unquote old fogey when it comes to tattoos, because younger readers, maybe impetuous, may think, why is this person giving me this kind of advice? I'll experience myself just as she did, because Kate does tell us at various points in this comic that she made some mistakes when she was young, and she wished she had made different choices along the way. But so she's coming from kind of an older, more informed and experienced position, and I think for some young readers that may come across as not as appealing, but that's fine. And so I respect her for potentially coming across to younger readers as a little more quote unquote mature.
Yes.
Yeah. And she's definitely all about safety.
Right. The part I found most interesting is early in the book, where she goes through, she has a diagram of the human body and goes through where the parts are that hurt the most and where the ones that hurt the least. But she does emphasize the fact that it hurts no matter what. Exactly.
But also, and she gives us the front and back silhouette of the human body, and she tells the reader where various places may be more sensitive, where it will hurt, where it may be easy. But she also provides a color code. So in those places, or on those places of the body where it's not that big of a deal, it's not going to hurt as much to get tattooed, those information bubbles, if we want to call them that, are in green. The kind of iffy places, it may or may not hurt or be as sensitive, seem to be in a kind of yellowish brown color. And then the potentially painful parts of the body where you can get a tattoo are in red.
Yes.
So she definitely makes this easy.
As easy as it could be, I guess.
As easy as it could be. See, this would I'm curious to know if this comic has been made available in a variety of different tattoo parlors. And if not, then there's a problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it should be, and she does give an acknowledgement page at the end, because one of the things that goes throughout this book too is that she quotes from different tattoo artists who give their advice along the way as well. And yeah, I mean this should be available in tattoo parlors certainly, or even also even on the web.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it'd be great. And one of the things I didn't ask Box about when I was talking with him is what kind of publicity marketing angle that they have. But, if someone wanted to be really active in getting ink for beginners out there to readers, hit up tattoo parlors.
Yes.
Definitely. So now that was the most recent publication from Retrofit Big Planet. That came out in May, as did Box Brown's own An Entity Observes All Things. Mm-hmm. I found An Entity Observes All Things interesting. Now, I knew that Brown had another comic, Numbers, or I guess he tells us to pronounce it as Numbers. I knew about that, but I hadn't read it before the book that came out last year on Andre the Giant. So my first exposure to Box Brown was the Andre the Giant book from First to Second, which you and I covered right around the time that it was released. Mm-hmm. So then I picked up An Entity Observes All Things, very, very different from Andre the Giant.
Yeah, this seems to be some of Box's more experimental works. I think even more experimental than Number is, because Number, at least the two issues that we've looked at, I think those are the only two that are out,
right,
do tell sustained narratives in a more kind of realistic vein. Mm-hmm. Right? I really, and not to jump to that stuff, but I really loved number one. That's hard to say. The Kayfabe Quarterly, which could almost be a kind of companion piece to Andre the Giant, since it's about the wrestling concept of kayfabe. But anyway, so both of those books do a bit longer. Number two has, I think, 2 short stories in it, but both are on a more realistic kind of level. And whereas An Entity Observes All Things is experimental both in terms of the storytelling that he does, as well as the content, which sometimes seems like science fiction maybe, but is really hard to pin down as a genre.
Exactly. Earlier at the top of this show, you had asked me if I had a sense of the kind of comics that Retrofit Big Planet put out by looking at everything that we got from these guys. And I said, well, the only thing I could put my finger on is the fact that there's so much difference. That's the similarity, the difference. Maybe a similar question for An Entity Observes All Things is, if you can look at all of these stories collected in this book, what would it be? And I think experimental would be one way of describing this. The kind of science fiction-y aspect would be another. Mm-hmm. But at the beginning of every story, there is an image of some kind of robot.
That's right.
Did you notice that?
Yeah.
And I think in about every case, none of these robots appear anywhere in the story, although the stories may have something to do with a robot-like creation.
Yeah, that's true. Did any of these stories stand out to you as ones that you liked particularly the most?
Maybe because it was the first one. It's the one that stuck with me the most, Memorexia. Mm-hmm. This is the story of someone named Sean, who is in some kind of contraption. Basically, he's lying on a table. His head is in some kind of machine. His hands and his feet and then his groin area seem to be encased in a similar kind of machine. And a guy is guiding him through some kind of process where he is revisiting his past. And it seems to me that there's something therapeutic about what's going on here. And Sean is revisiting his time with his father before his father died. And I think that one stood out to me. Again, it could be just because of it being the first one, and I think I may have read that about 3 times because I started this book and then put it down for a couple of days and then went back to restart it. What about you? Which of the stories stand out for you?
I thought that, first of all, that the Voyage of the Golden Retriever was hilarious.
Oh yeah,
and especially had a great punchline, and it reminded me a little bit of Kevin Cannon's Far Arden and Crater 15 stories. With that character, and you've got a kind of adventurer on these strange adventures, and they throw in a lot of kind of absurd gags. But probably my favorite of the stories is the second story, Mundo Jelly, and that's just because that's the one I associate with the most, because it is about a college professor making a podcast.
Yeah, I wondered about that, if this would come up in our discussion. And not only that, not only a college professor who does a podcast, but also creates, I guess, the best tasting waffles ever. That's
right, and that's where I'm not. That's where my association ends with the story, though. Though my wife Jennifer, who's also a college professor, made waffles this morning, and they were very good.
Really? So, are you not a big waffles fan?
I am a huge waffles fan. I just don't make them.
Okay, I see.
So anyway, and so I particularly want a T-shirt of the character in this who's recording his podcast. As he's on. I should mention. So he's on this planet, and he's seeking out this jelly on this planet that is supposed to be one of the best tasting things in the universe.
Yes,
and he's going to try to manufacture it. Yeah.
It's liquefied gods.
Yes, exactly.
They have destroyed themselves, and I guess the residue is this white-looking goo that is, as the professor puts it, it's delicious raw.
Yes, and it actually ends up causing him to go to sleep. It's so good. This taste is so intense, and he figures out then how he can manufacture it. But at one point in the recording of his podcast, he says, "As a college professor, I'm used to dealing with low-life scum." And I want to just get that panel isolated and maybe put on my coffee mug.
Maybe you can contact Box about that.
But I think that story, I think, gets to what Box's absurdist sense of humor, how it works, because there's stuff in there that just made me laugh over and over again, where he talks about this design he has created to intensify the jelly's flavor, and he says this design is mathematically engineered to maximize flavor and lubricate the throat. I still think there may be some utility for my earlier designs, and his earlier designs were called Big Willie Style, The Serpent, and Kid Dynamite. So there you go. But yeah, so I enjoyed that story a lot. That story made me laugh. But I think that it's an interesting contrast then that you mentioned that first story, because that first story, I think, shows one of the things that Brown does really well, which is do stories that have a real emotional punch. And I think that, that's true of Andre the Giant, as well as some of his other stuff. Whereas also there's the stories that have this really kind of sharp and absurdist sense of humor. So there's a nice balance in his work.
Right. Now, the story Travel, I like it. It wasn't one of my favorites of the collection, but it stands out for me because the art seems strikingly different from the rest of the collection. And then, but another one of my favorites is the title story, An Entity Observes All Things. And one reason I really like that is it's not necessarily a circular story, but it almost begins as it ends. So I guess in that sense, it can be read as a circular story. It starts off with this entity, thus the title, who is somewhere in space, and it says that this entity observes all things. And then we get the process, or a process, of what happens with this entity and his relationship with, let's say, certain plants on this planet, and where this entity goes and what the plants do, and how what the plants secrete lead to another entity. Mm-hmm. And then we get a new entity that is observing everything. Again, so we're back at the beginning. So I really like that.
Yep.
And maybe it's the color purple that I appreciate, because in many of these stories, they have, I guess they're monochromatic. Now, there are one or two that are only black and white, but the vast majority have a theme of one color. Not all of them. For instance, Mondo Jelly is green and yellow.
Right. And then, the Voyage of the Golden Retriever is blue and red.
Right. But others, like An Entity Observes All Things, is purple. The New Physics is kind of a reddish pink, I guess. So on and so forth. So, yeah, that's another one of my favorites of this collection. But again, one of the things that stood out for me in Box Brown's An Entity Observes All Things, it's a kind of a different side of what I knew him as through Andre the Giant. Yeah.
And one of the, you mentioned the story An Entity Observes All Things, and that story brought up something else I was thinking of in relationship to what we're seeing in Retrofit Big Planet's output all together. Because as I was reading these books, and we mentioned the idea that all of them have a kind of experimental component to it, and I really feel like, at least I use terms like experimental or avant-garde to say to encapsulate things that I just don't know what to call them. Right? I don't have another word for them, and so that's what I use. But I think that if there's something that can be more narrowly identified, and this isn't true for every work by any means, but that there's a strong use of fable in a lot of these, or a fable-ish type narrative. And I think even An Entity Observes All Things, that story itself has that kind of feeling of a fable, even though it's not quite like what you would get out of, Aesop or Bill Willingham.
Exactly. And, now that you mentioned fable, you're right. You can see something like that coming out in a number of the Retrofit Big Planet comics that we received. And one that I think fits that perfectly is a book that came out last year, Madeline Flores's Bear, Bird, and Stag Were Arguing in the Forest, and other stories. And in fact, all of the stories in this book are like alternate fairy tales.
Yeah, that's the one that made me think of this kind of idea as part of a unifying force behind these. But even Sam Alden's Wicked Chicken Queen.
Yeah, that's another one, yeah.
Ben C's Eyelash Out, and what else? And maybe even a little bit James Kachalka's Fungus. All have that quality to it, and it makes me think about this type of alternative comic in general. And this may get off a little bit on a tangent, but one of the things that reading these books made me think about is kind of what we do on this podcast, because these books collectively, all I can't remember how many books they sent us, but quite a few. But even the 7 that we're looking at closely that came out last year, these fit in my mind what we might be a kind of pure alternative comic,
right?
And so, when we distinguish this podcast as alternative from the mainstream, we're mainly focused on the idea of the kind of Marvel and DC superhero comics being the mainstream and other things being non-mainstream. But I think that there are plural mainstreams now, depending on how someone goes about getting their comics. You can have, if you get your comics in the comic shop, certainly the Marvel and DC superheroes are dominant. But if people get their comics in bookstores or through, say, Amazon, there's other genres that tend to dominate, like autobiography and
comics that are commonly called graphic novels.
And coming of age stories, right? And then even within the non-Marvel and DC comics that are advertised in previews, Image, for example, is pretty heavily genre dominant. Science fiction being the primary genre, but also some noir and things like that. So when you move kind of further on the spectrum of alternative comics, you get into the stuff like that Big Planet Retrofit puts out, and then I think maybe moving slightly further to the alternative side of the spectrum, you get the truly independent stuff, the mini comics and self-published work that people do that you can get at conventions or through the web. And it seems like a lot of that stuff, a lot of that other end of the alternative spectrum, if any genre can dominate that, I'm not sure, but you do get a lot of autobiography, and we have some of that stuff in here too. You get some science fiction, but it's much more kind of experimental, I guess, for lack of a better word, science fiction, but also this kind of idea of the fable, which I'm using not just to include stuff like the Bear, Bird, and Stag, which clearly feels like a moral lesson is being taught in each of these stories, which is one of the defining characteristics of fable. But also these stories in which the creators have invented a wholly unique and independent world that has its own sense of physics and own way in which the characters operate and behave.
Oh, exactly. Getting back to your earlier question about what distinguishes Retrofit Big Planet as a publisher, another thing outside of the difference in the experimentation, which we've mentioned, is the fact that these titles and this publisher, or these two publishers, Retrofit and Big Planet, they have a secure foot in that far end of the spectrum that you had mentioned in terms of the alternate indie and mini comic. I mentioned earlier that some of the titles that we're discussing today are actually, as they come to us, the format is in mini comic form. Some of these books are larger, some are more, let's say, typical comic book size, and some are mini comic size. And, for all practical purposes, they're mini comics. Now, the fact that they're distributed through Retrofit, Big Planet, and then maybe other co-ops or other means, I don't think it diminishes this kind of self-published mini comic feel that they have. It's just that any one of these books, for the most part, I think, is something like you would find that someone makes on their own. They photocopy, they staple, and then they take to their local shop or to conventions that are local to them and try to sell them that way. And so I think that, and along with this, because these comics are like that, it's difficult to find them. So you're right. There are other kinds of mainstream. Even if we take DC and Marvel out of the mix, it's easy enough for our listeners to find comics put out through Dark Horse and Image and Dynamite and other, let's say, premier publishers. Or even smaller ones. But how often are our listeners going to walk into a comic shop, even the big ones, and find something from Retrofit Big Planet? I don't think it would be that frequent that would happen.
Right, unless one is lucky enough to live in an urban area that can support a place like this. Like, I would guess that somebody who shops regularly, for example, at Quimby's in Chicago would not have as much of a problem as, say, somebody who shops at the one comic book store in the city that they live in that generally tends to focus on Marvel and DC. I mean, I remember talking to comic shop owners in this area that I live in, saying that they don't even bother carrying Image comics or even look at the Image section of the previous catalog or the order form when they're ordering, other than maybe to get Walking Dead.
Right.
Because there's just no audience for that stuff in the community that they serve.
Right. So if our listeners are really curious about the Retrofit Big Planet titles that we're discussing in this episode, and you should be, right? Then probably the best place for you to find them is going to their website. It's either retrofitcomics.com or bigplanetcomics.com. And either place will lead you to a shop where you can actually purchase these online. So, there are ways for people, even in remote areas, even if they have shops that do not carry anything other than DC Marvel, ways for them to get these titles that we're discussing.
Yeah, and one of the things that Retrofit Big Planet does that I really like, that I think other publishers on this end of the spectrum are doing, is that they offer an annual subscription where you can get all of their output for that year for one price. So Retrofit does this for $75. You can get all of the 2015 comics that they've produced or are going to produce. And I know like Oily Comics does this as well, another mini comics collective, and Uncivilized Books does this as well.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just smart.
Yeah, and I think that builds a kind of brand loyalty for the audience to be able to associate, even though we're kind of talking about the incredible variety that we're getting here, you can kind of associate a different kind of comic with Retrofit or with any of these other publishers that are doing this. But also, that subscription is a great way to say, you recognize, Matt Madden, Box Brown, or Kate Leth from the list, but may not recognize some of these other creators, and by getting the subscription rather than ordering the individual books, you get exposed to other stuff that you may not have seen otherwise.
Exactly. Now, you were mentioning the experimental aspect of Retrofit. To me, of the 2015 releases of these 7 titles that we're particularly focusing in on, the most experimental, I'd say that An Entity Observes All Things is there, definitely. But even more so than that is Niv Bavarsky's Piggy. And this is a very short comic in mini comic form. Not that many pages at all. at first I thought that this was going to be, especially as short as it is, a story or just a single story issue. That it was about someone or something called Piggy, because the very first page is you find the word piggy and an image of a pig's head. So I thought, okay, well, this will be about a pig. But then we get into what I guess is the first story, Smell the Flowers. I'm assuming that this is the title. And you have a couple kissing. And then the guy, it looks like he gets up and goes outside. He's bitten by a pig. So, okay, this is where the pig comes in, the piggy. And then the pig runs away and the guy chases after him. And then there are a couple of images right before you get to the very center of the book. You got a guy or someone smoking with a cup of coffee. And then another person with a pig setting a pig on its head on a pedestal and a pineapple sitting up on top of its ass. And then in the very center of the book, you have these two images, one of which definitely does refer to a pig, sausage and all. But then after that, you get just other bits. There's only one other story, as far as I could tell, called Last Ditch, that I would call a story, which is about a group of people who are rolling this gigantic boulder into a volcano before it explodes. But then the other bits here just seem to be one-page illustrations. Like there's one that I liked. It's called Death Wishes. And on this page we have a series of heads. And most of these heads are telling us, I guess, what their death wish is. For instance, one guy who almost looks like Freud says, too much of the sex. Someone says, sucked into a black hole. Another person says, erotic asphyxiation. And someone else, preferably anvil, but I'll take banana peel. And there are a lot of these that are like that. So
Beheaded by Beyonce.
But, you know, and then there are other illustrations as well. There's a picture of a guy looking at a carrot crying, and then I guess this is the title of the piece, Lamenting a Root Vegetable. So Piggy just strikes me as one of the most experimental of the 7 releases from this year that Retrofit Big Planet have put out. What did you think of Piggy?
Yeah, I feel like this book is the closest to something I might pick up at a con at somebody's table that as a mini comic the person put together in order to kind of showcase their different styles and sensibilities, because Bavarsky does not use a consistent style throughout this book. Even this short book, the individual single page pieces all vary quite a bit. Last Ditch doesn't look much like Smell the Flowers, and so you do get a real showcase of the different styles he works in.
Yeah, and in fact, the aforementioned Lamenting a Root Vegetable and the story the image that's right next to it, Frustrated Youth Hungry for Sandwich. I don't know about you, but that art style reminded me a little bit of Durf Back Durf.
Yeah. Yeah, especially the sandwich one.
Now, in contrast to that, another recent release, Sea Urchin, this is by Laura Gnetzger, is more in the, I guess we can call it, traditional autobiography style.
Right. And like a lot of contemporary comics autobiographies, it is kind of documenting her battles with, I guess, depression, or some, the sea urchin in the title is this feeling she has in her head that she cannot work around, right? That her job becomes much more difficult to do, and her life in general seems more difficult to live because of this what she calls a big sea urchin in the middle of her brain. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's an effective way of kind of documenting the day-to-day issues that Netsker is experiencing, where she has difficulty listening to people. She feels like she's living in a hole. She finds herself lashing out at people as well. And so this book is kind of documenting all those things. But it doesn't seem to follow a linear narrative by any means.
Yeah, you're right there. And a couple things along those lines that I wanted to point out. Mm-hmm. Well, first, I really do like the metaphor of the sea urchin, all prickly, and we even see her at one point fairly early on in the book where she tells us about this feeling that she has and describes it as a sea urchin. She says, "There's a big sea urchin in the middle of my brain. It's a bother because I have to do all my thinking around it. I'm doing half the amount of work, but working twice as hard." And in the illustrations on these 2 pages that I just read from, you see her with this almost like a silhouette of the sea urchin on top of her head, or it's like inside of her head, and it's frustrating her. So I really do like that as a way of describing or trying to make sense of whatever problem she has. And the problem is ambiguous, and I think you were mentioning this earlier. On the one hand, maybe this is something neurological. It could be something with the brain, right? That maybe she has problems attending to detail. Maybe she has OCD. I don't know. It could be any number of things. But then later on in the story, it seems that she's taking on other issues that are much more existential in nature. And I think this gets back to that comment that you made about the lack of linearity here. For me, the last quarter of this book, I don't want to suggest that it deters from what she's doing in the first 3 quarters, but it seems to take a different direction. Maybe it goes a little more broad than the earlier parts, where she's not talking about specific ways or problems that she's having with doing work and concentrating and getting along with others, but larger issues of self-image and being in the world, which, granted, is part and parcel of these other more pointed, so to speak, conditions that she points out in the first half or so of the book. But it does seem to get a little off topic in a way in that last quarter.
I think this book flows through topics so much that I didn't recognize a kind of departure from that. And there are things in that last quarter of the book that I really admired, like when she's discussing her online life. She says something that really struck me. Social media is a diary you keep for other people. I've never had it articulated that way, but I really find that that's a really kind of fascinating way to think about social media. And probably other people have articulated it that way. I also appreciate those moments where she talks about the act of cartooning itself, or doing comics, and there's one point where, and this is later in the book too, where she's kind of lying face down in a pile of pages that she's been working on, and she says, "You've been drawing the same story over and over. Are you getting closer to me, or are you just unimaginative?" And the me is this kind of pixie figure that floats through part of the middle of the book. That idea too of the repetitiveness of autobiographical comics, especially, You know, when we talked to Miss Lasco Gross, she talked about how, you know, one of her reasons for doing Henny was because she was tired of drawing herself over and over and over again. The repetitiveness of drawing yourself and being kind of immersed in, you're re-immersing yourself in your own experiences through autobiographical comics is a kind of common comment that those creators who work in that genre mention. So I liked her approach to that idea.
Netzger's, you mean?
Yeah, Netzger's, yeah.
Right. You know, and along with that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a couple of pages before the one that you alluded to, where she's lying down on top of all of these pages, these illustrations of herself, there is a section where she, I think, foregrounds the act of illustration as a therapeutic means for her of dealing with herself, her condition, and her, you know, the way that she interacts with others. This is a page that we find a couple of blank panels at the top. She says, "If I leave a gap, someone will fill it in." And then we see in that next row her in front of a mirror getting ready to wash her face. People love filling in blanks. Ambiguity is an invitation. And then you turn the page and we see her wiping off her face. Now, what I think is brilliant about this section, and it leads right into the part that you mentioned earlier, is when we see her begin to wipe her face, to clean her face, the way that Netzger illustrates herself is more realistic in nature. So, for instance, we can make out her eyebrows, the contour of her eyebrows. Her pupils, they're a little more detailed. Her nose. As she wipes her face, then the detail becomes stripped down to where the eye, the iris, the contours of the eye becomes just a black circle. The texture of the eyebrow becomes an one-line arch. And so I think in this one page, as she is wiping her face from a more realistic representation to something that's a little more iconic, she's doing a variety of things here. I immediately thought of Scott McCloud and, you know, in Understanding Comics, that famous comment about we can identify with individuals more if they are more simple and iconic in their presentation. You know, now whether you agree with that or not, that's something that's going on here. But at the same time, this section tells us something about why she's doing what she's doing. She's making her comics in order to reach out, to connect, and to understand herself. And so by wiping her face in a way that presents her as a cartoon, then it's her way of dealing with what she has to deal with.
Yeah. That's interesting that you mentioned the you know, understanding yourself, but also reaching out, because one of the final lines of the book is her saying, you know, "I'm glad you're reading this," and you know, the final page poses the question, "Why were you born?" But also ends with, "I'm glad you're reading this," so that it ends on this moment of connection with the reader. Now, I'm glad you mentioned that page, too, because that page is one that really struck me. And in going back and looking through this, one of the things related to that struck me is the varying styles that Netzger uses throughout the book. Some are starkly different from what we might consider the kind of main, more iconic style that dominates the book, but there's other moments where she uses a much thinner line, or where the drawing becomes rougher and more kind of frenetic, and other places where, like, there's a 2-page sequence where she's using a really, really thick line that and a gray wash on the pages that tends to resemble other independent cartoonists' work.
Yeah, and in one or two places where she draws her face, particularly her eyes, in ways that reminds me of manga.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So that I like her use of style to reflect the emotional changes that she's going through, or emotional experiences she's having.
Yeah, I really like Sea Urchin, and something that you and I have mentioned every now and again. There are a lot of comics autobiographies out there, comics memoirs. Anyone can do it. Anyone can draw and write about their own life, whether it's good or not. And so it's almost easy now to become cynical about memoir or autobiography comics. And you mentioned the final page of Sea Urchin, where there is this recognition of the reader and a kind of connectedness that's going on here. You're right, that is a very effective ending. And if one were reading this as a cynic, I think that by the time they get to the end of the book, then any kind of cynicism or dismissiveness should be out the window now, because I really liked it. I didn't think that this fell back on the old, time-worn tropes of memoir comics, because something that Netzger makes clear is she's very much aware of what she's doing. I wouldn't call this an overtly metafictional or meta-autobiographical comic, but it's something subtly like that, though.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that one of the real benefits to this book, makes us stand out in that huge field of autobiography that's existing in comics now, is the way she approaches the visual style. In reading about, reading criticism of contemporary autobiographical comics, a lot of the kind of the unthought out negative criticism that, say, Marjane Satrapi gets, or Jeffrey Brown, is that their art looks so easy, so like thrown together and primitive, like there's no discernible style here. That those styles are choices that those creators make. That's what's not understood in that criticism, is those styles are choices that those creators make to tell those stories. And what Netzger really does is bring to the surface that idea that in autobiography, style is a choice. And she's choosing a variety of different styles throughout this short work to indicate her changes and her feelings.
Now, Sea Urchin, along with Piggy, came out in April, and another Retrofit Big Planet release that came out that same month is another one that works within a particular genre, and that is Jack Teagle's The Unmentionables. And this is probably, if not the biggest, it's one of the two biggest size-wise comics that we're discussing on this episode. Now, were you familiar with Teagle's work before this?
I don't think so, but in looking at The Unmentionables, I feel like I've seen it. I can't pin down where.
When I talked with Box earlier and asked him where he finds these artists, he made that comment that basically everything that comes out through Retrofit is, Box Brown's favorites. And so he publishes the people that he really enjoys. So it makes sense to me that The Unmentionables deals with wrestling.
Deals with basically wrestlers who become superhero crime fighters.
Yeah. And like I said earlier, Teagle also does a comic for Nobrow called Fight, and it's Fight with an exclamation mark. I've never read it, but that deals with wrestling as well.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. I think you've described what The Unmentionables is all about. These are pro wrestlers who, look a little different, but then they become heroes.
And villains.
And villains, right. So we have these professional wrestlers. There's one group who are, and what is the lingo? I'm not hip on the wrestler lingo. If they're the ones that go down, the villains, what are they called?
There's the heels and the faces.
The heels, okay. So, it's the heels in this comic, The Unmentionables, that end up being difficult. They decide that they're going to take things into their own hands, and they attempt to rob a bank.
Right.
And then it's the faces that become the heroes. They go to fight the heels, and I get a sense from the Unmentionables that this is going to be the first of what could be a series.
Yeah, it does feel like that we could get more. This is the Unmentionables origin story.
Right.
And in fact, they don't become a crime-fighting team until the very last page, where they say, where Lizard Woman says when being interviewed, we're the Unmentionables, and the interviewer even says, I've never seen anything like it. A crime-stopping wrestling team. It's like something out of a comic book. Yeah.
I know. And this was fun. I mean, unlike some of the titles that we've been discussing, for instance, Sea Urchin, where there's something deep going on here, right? Even earlier ones we mentioned, Ink for Beginners and Entity Observes All Things. Unmentionables, it's a serious comic, but it's serious fun.
Mm-hmm.
It starts off with a wrestling match where there's a lot of fighting, a lot of action, and then next we get to the crime itself, where the heels become the real villains in robbing a bank,
right? And
then the Unmentionables become who they become, this crime-fighting team.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a fun book. I really enjoyed the Unmentionables a lot.
Yeah. Of the character, I mean, there's what's her name? The Lizard
Woman.
Lizard Woman, who is also called Liz. I like her, but it's Mr. Muscles.
Yeah,
is one of my favorites. Just the name, Mr. Muscles.
Yeah,
I think it's just funny. So I like this one. I want to check out more of Teagle's work.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things about doing these kind of episodes, not just the podcast in general, but I think specifically the Publisher Spotlight shows, where we look at a lot of titles for just one show, and we're always introduced to people that at least I'm not familiar with before. So I want to check out some of Jack Teagle's other comics.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so of the other ones that have come out this year, that leaves us with Mowgli's Mirror and Drawn Onward. I don't want to say that these are my two favorites, but I will say that they are two of my favorites that have come out from Retrofit Big Planet in 2015. And earlier when you said that if not next year, then the following year, we're going to be looking at some of these Retrofit Big Planet titles in Best American Comics for that particular year. These, to me, are the two biggest candidates.
That's interesting.
Mowgli's Mirror and Drawn Onward.
Yeah, I would say that I would hope to see something from one of the short stories from an Entity Observes All Things in there. As well.
I would hope so as well. It's just, to me, the biggest two candidates, and I guess because the kind of works that they are, were those from Schwarven and Madden.
Yeah, so Olivier Schwarven's Mowgli's Mirror is the opposite, I guess, of a mini comic.
Right.
It's a maxi comic.
Yeah,
coining that term now.
Yeah.
It's a very large format. Maybe not quite the Treasury edition size of the DC and Marvel Treasury books that they put out in the back in the 70s, but definitely much larger than a standard comic or even a standard magazine. And it's a completely silent comic as well, and as the title Mowgli's Mirror implies, it's kind of set in the world, in the milieu of the Jungle Book. Though I wouldn't say it's an adaptation of anything from the Jungle Book.
No, not that I'm aware of.
No, Yeah, so because unless Mowgli became erotically attracted to Baloo at some point, I don't know what connection that would have otherwise.
Yeah, because there's something both realistic and surreal about Mowgli's mirror.
Yes.
And the story is relatively straightforward. We have a human, and I guess this is Mowgli.
Mm-hmm. And it's silent, too.
It's silent, right. Yeah. He meets an orangutan, and the orangutan begins to ape him, so to speak, so imitates his movements, his actions, and so in essence becomes a mirror to Mowgli. Mm-hmm. And then they become connected, and then there is some kind of not only attraction, but also, I guess we could call it insemination of the orangutan, which at first I didn't know was female, but then we learned that it does become female because she ends up giving birth, and then their relationship takes a turn.
Okay, now wait, hang on a second. Are you suggesting that Mowgli inseminates the orangutan?
I say some kind of insemination goes on. Now, we don't see anything physical, sexual going on, but at one point, Mowgli and the orangutan are looking into a body of water, and they see their reflection, and Mowgli sees his reflection, and he dips his hand into the water, and we can see his image reflected back in the water in his hand. And it's that image that the orangutan sips and ingests.
Okay. I see.
And so there's this one-page image that it's in a somewhat different style where we see this. Well, it could be a drop of water with Mowgli's face on it, or it could be the sperm that's going down into the orangutan. And then next thing we know, something is going on with the orangutan. She's about to give birth. And then the head that starts to come out looks human, but it's actually a little baby orangutan. So again, it's not as if Mowgli bangs the orangutan for some kind of interspecies thing. Oh, it's one point. Yeah, and that's what causes the rift between them, it seems.
Yes.
That she, as a mother, is rather put off by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and okay, yeah, I never got that. I read, and I think you're right in your reading of that scene where the orangutan sips the water out of Mowgli's hand, because I just read the image of that one-page image of the orangutan with the face as being a word balloon.
Huh, that's interesting. I didn't see that as a word balloon.
But now I know that's probably not the case. It's more like what you're describing. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's either the drop of water or a sperm. Or both.
Yeah. And so that there's problems with that relationship. Mowgli also seems to be fairly naive when it comes to the interactions between animals in the jungle, where he befriends a wolf who then proves to be a threat because wolves and orangutans, I'm guessing, don't get along.
Right.
He meets up with an elephant and has an interesting encounter with that elephant.
It deals with elephant droppings.
Yeah. And so on. He seems to deal with, after the orangutan leaves, he deals with these issues of loneliness that he is experiencing. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's an interesting silent narrative. I'm always fascinated by the ways in which comics can tell stories without words.
Right.
And I think this is an interesting and effective way of going about that.
Yes, and it's also worth mentioning that this is, I guess, a dichromatic comic in that the primary colors are orange and blue.
Right.
And so Schwarben uses the colors quite effectively in representing both the orangutan, the orange, and also other animals, and then the blue, which is Mowgli, and then the one other human we get in this, which is we see at the very end. Yeah. So now, I was not familiar with the work of Olivier Schwarben, who actually goes by, I guess, O. Schwarben on his books, until late last year when Arsène Schwarben came out from Fantagraphics. Were you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, because, I got that, and that is a fascinating book. Now, that is not a wordless narrative. It's a longer one, and it's the story of Olivier's grandfather, Arsène, and what he went through. But it's, in terms of the art, and especially the color, this is why I'm mentioning this, it's very similar in that you have the shades of blue and orange as well. Darker orange, darker blue, lighter orange, lighter blue going on, also in that Fantagraphics book. So I don't know if that's I don't know if that's a particular style of Schwarben's or not, but from these two works of his that I do know, that's a common characteristic.
Yeah.
I really like this one, as I did Drawn Onward.
Yeah, now this is, I think it's interesting that even though we didn't plan on this, that we're ending with Matt Madden's work, because of the creators in here, Madden's probably the best known. Mm-hmm. And I found this to be a really fascinating work that is experimental in some ways, but is but also accessible.
Yes.
In that it tells. I have trouble saying a linear narrative because it's a kind of a circular narrative, ending where it begins. And it also is something of, I want to say, an experiment in style, though to say that about Matt Madden, since he did the, what's the name of that book? 99
Ways to Tell a Story.
99 Ways to Tell a Story, which is basically a book-length experiment in style, telling the same story in 99 different art styles.
Which is great.
Yes. And so he uses basically two different styles in this. One, a kind of heavier ink, thicker line style in the flashback, and a fine line, thinner line style for the framing device, which is basically the female cartoonist who's trying to draw the story of her experience, which she describes in the very first line as a double suicide note.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think, you mentioned 99 Ways to Tell a Story. I think that if you want to get a sense of Matt Madden as an experimental artist, I think that's probably the best example to turn to. But before that, though, he did a couple of issues of A Fine Mess that are rather experimental as well, and I really appreciated those. And one of the reasons why I really like Drawn Onward is that I have really missed Matt Madden over the past several years. It has been a long, long time since I read Black Candy, Odds Off, and A Fine Mess. And I know that he did those two books with his significant other, Jessica Abel, with First Second, drawing words and writing pictures, and then Mastering Comics, drawing words and writing pictures, continued. And those are great instructional texts.
Right.
And of course, along with Abel, he was, the co-editor of the Best American Comics series for the first several years, or well, not the first one or two volumes, but I can't. What was the name of the first editor?
Oh, I forgot.
Right, but after the first one or two, he and Jessica Abel became the editors up to 2013, and then they passed the baton to Karlopoulos. Right. So
and Elizabeth Moore was the first editor.
Okay, there you go. So he had he was busy doing other things instead of creating his own comics, and so it's really nice to see Drawn Onward. So I'm glad about that. But also, I really like the circular nature of this, and it's one of the reasons why it's circular. It's because it's symmetrical.
Yes.
And in fact, I didn't realize the symmetry of this thing until I got halfway through, which I guess makes sense, unless if you're one who reads forward or reads ahead and looks at certain things, and you may recognize certain patterns and layouts. If you open the book to its very center where you can see the staples, then you see the man and the woman in this story kissing.
Right.
And then you turn the page, you begin to notice, now, wait a minute, I just recently saw this page layout, but it was inverted, wasn't it? And you turn back to the two pages, and yes, it was. And then I was going through, this is a symmetrical inverted mirror image narrative, and I think in that sense it's brilliant.
Right. So it on the surface it's using the narrative, the layout, I guess, and narrative approach of or layout approach of Chapter 5 of Watchmen.
Right, exactly.
Which is in which each page kind of lays itself out as a mirror of the other. But I think it takes a step even further than Watchmen by making the story itself. The first half of the story literally as a narrative mirrors the second half of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not just
visually.
Visually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the first half of this book is the story of this woman who is a cartoonist who is using her art in order to understand this strange experience she has with someone that she seems to keep meeting in the subway and thinks that he is following her, but then she becomes intrigued and charmed by it and ends up being a little forward with him. They meet, which results in this one kiss that we see at the very center of the book. But then the last half of this story, which visually is a mirror of the first half, as we discussed, it's more of the man's story and about his annoyance at this woman who is trying to get to know him and about his distancing from her and how she becomes unsettled by this. And so whereas in the first part of the book she's the strong character and the one in control, by the end she's the one without the power, without the control, who needs to do the comic in order to make sense of things, which brings us back to the very beginning. Right.
And even the inside covers are mirrors of each other. When you get to the end, which in seeing that kind of compelled me to read the book backwards, almost in kind of manga style.
Yeah.
And it doesn't quite work, but it does work.
Yeah.
Enough that you can do it.
Well, as long as you read on each page from left to right,
yeah,
it would work. For the most part, I guess. But yeah, I really like this. So this is one I think that, along with Mowgli's Mirror, and maybe even one or two stories from An Entity Observes All Things, are probably going to be those, if any of these, are collected in Best American Comics over the next year or so.
Yeah, and not only that, even if it's not, Drawn Onward is a comic that I would love to work into a class.
Oh, definitely.
If I could, because this is a story that can only be told in comics form. The choices that Madden makes here to tell the story, you couldn't do this in any other medium to the same effect.
Right.
And so once you kind of start pulling the threads of it, of the experiment that he's doing, and just seeing just how intensely formal it is, it becomes even more fascinating. Though I do kind of wish that the final page didn't give it away so completely.
What, the beginning of my story was the end of his, and the beginning of his story was the end of me?
Well, no, not so much that, but that, that she actually instructs the reader to go back through what you have just read, and you will understand why I had no other option. That is, that she had no other option, literally had no other option but to tell the story as a comic, because no other narrative form could tell the story. That's, that in and of itself is interesting. But it feels like it kind of gives it away a little too much.
That maybe Madden was a little heavy-handed there?
Yeah, that the attentive reader should figure out the kind of reading experience can go both ways. Though, right. Again, I think the idea, though, that's the most interesting there is that she says that you will understand why I had to do this. That is why, why I had no other option. And what we might think is no other option but to kind of try to write the story down to make sense of it. But what she really means is no other option but to do this as a comic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, it is. I think it's one of those rare works that really shows us what comics can do.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned using this in the classroom. Mm-hmm. This is something that maybe you can contact Jared in Box and say, hey, I want you to sell me a lot of copies to hand out to my class.
Yeah.
And it's something that even if they don't give you a discount, that you could afford to do, or the students could afford to get. And this is something we haven't even mentioned about the Retrofit Big Planet titles that we've been discussing. All of these books are quite affordable. So, for instance, Drawn Onward lists for $5. Mm-hmm. Unmentionable, which is one of the bigger ones, is $6. Mowgli's Mirror, which is the biggest size-wise, what is that listed as? I don't see a price.
$8.
$8, yeah, at the bottom. So, but these are definitely all affordable. This is something that you don't find with a lot of small presses like this. Sometimes, just because of the very nature of what they have to do, they have to charge a little more, let's say, than larger publishers like Image, for an example, might be able to sell, because they don't have the same kind of volume. So it's like, I would very much like to get this Uncivilized book or this one from Madhouse or Ad House, not Madhouse, but $25? I have to pay for $25 for this Ad House book. Well, that's what they have to do in terms of the print run and all that goes into it. So, but these books are all quite affordable. So if someone wanted to get quite a big taste of Retrofit Big Planet comics, it doesn't have to hurt the bank account. Yeah,
the two biggest books in terms of page count that we got are An Entity Observes All Things and James Kochalka's Fungus, The Unbearable Rot of Being, I think. And both of those are $12.
Right. And that's still really good.
Yes, that's a book that would probably normally be around $15. And then if you order these through the subscription, you get the 12 books for $75, which is, again, still a pretty good deal.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Kochalka's Fungus, The Unbearable Rottenness of Being. We've mentioned a few times that we got an entire package from Box and Jared in that they sent us not only this year's releases, but everything from 2014 and then even into 2013. And maybe before we close out this publisher spotlight, I want to ask you, of those other titles, because you and I have read all of these, what of those earlier works really stand out to you that you'd like to mention?
One that we didn't get that I've read, one of the few of the Retrofit books I've read before this, is Tom Hart's Rosalie Lightning. That they put out. That's sold out, but one of the nice things about Retrofit Big Planet too is that they have a pretty healthy online comics program as well, and so even if their stuff is sold out in print, you can go and get it online. And I know Rosalie Lightning is available through comicsology, as are most of these.
Now, wasn't that also in last year's Best American Comics?
Well, what was in last year's Best American Comics was the kind of devastating follow-up to Rosalie Lightning, which is
so that's
RL,
yes.
which is the story of how Tom Hart and his wife dealt with the loss of their daughter.
Right.
Whereas Rosalie Lightning is about the daughter, about living with her. And so anyway, so those that's available. But anyway, of the stuff we got, I'm always glad to see something by Sam Alden. So Wicked Chicken Queen, which is again an interesting experimental work.
That's a great one.
Something I would consider also along the lines of a fable. But in this case, each page appears to be a single panel in the narrative, and Alden is using what I think is a pencil-only style.
Because it has those smudged looks in places.
Yeah, which I like as part of his style. And then I like both of Box Brown's Number comics, and I don't know, and Akino Konda's Nothing Whatsoever, All Out in the Open.
Yeah. Kondo's I enjoyed. That got a little... Well, it took some getting used to in terms of reading it.
Right.
Yeah, because the speech in it runs down.
Right, and it looks like the translator has tried to capture the kind of visual quality of the original Japanese.
Right, and in fact, of the books that we got in this big Retrofit Big Planet package, there are two, I guess you would call alternative manga works. One is, what you just mentioned, Nothing Whatsoever, All Out in the Open, and then the other one is a title from 2013, and that is Zijian Shen's Keep Fresh.
Yeah.
And that was also a little difficult to read in terms of the fact that it was being translated. It took some getting used to of getting the story down after the first few pages.
That's right.
Digest it.
Because that does an interesting approach to that translation, which is to put to keep the original art and the original
Japanese
text, and then put basically footnotes at the bottom of the page with the with the English translation. And I think part of the reason to do that is because the Zhejian Shen uses the Japanese characters in a very strong visual sense that may not have been duplicatable in if the lettering were transferred into English.
Right. Of all of the titles that we received in this package, there was one that actually I had read previously, and I read this last year around the time that it came up, and that is Kolchanka's Fungus, The Unbearable Rot of Being. Oh, and I love this book.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I've said on the show before that I like Kolchanka, although there's sometimes that I'll read his stuff and I think, it's okay. But this is one of those that my reaction is very enthusiastic. And the way that this book is set up, it's great. It's basically a series of vignettes with talking fungi. And the fungi are discussing different issues, and they have, I guess, a weighty feel to them. So the various sections, well, it starts off with, I guess one could say, a less than weighty topic, comic books. But then you got these two different kinds of fungus that are trying to describe what a comic book is. But then you get to topics like cyberspace and religion and fantasy, philosophy. What are these things? And the way that the different kinds, shapes, and sizes of fungi discuss these topics and have these dialogues, it's just hilarious. And I think this is Kolchanka's style of humor at its best.
Yeah, I agree. This is another book that when I read it, I wanted some. I want to get T-shirts or coffee mugs made out of some of these panels. Like, I never should have eaten all those comic books. Or
that's a great one.
If you say comic book one more time, I'm going to throw up on you. The conflict in the first story is that the smaller fungus has eaten the comic book collection of the taller fungus during a party that got out of hand, and in which comic books were eaten. But then also it seems like the same two later are conversing, and the tall one says, "Sometimes I wish I was a comic book because comics are awesome."
One of my favorite sections is the one on email, where you have the two fungi who are talking. One has a new email account, and basically this email account is a puddle.
Yeah.
And as leaves fall into the puddle, that's an email that he gets.
Right.
So a leaf falls down, and one fungus says to the other, "Well, would you look at that? I just got an email." And the other guy says, "Can I get an email too? It looks pretty fun." "You? No, I don't think so." "Why not?" "I know that I make it look easy, but you'd probably just screw it up. Honestly, you're such a noob." And as more leaves fall down into the puddle, he's got more emails, and it impresses this smaller, piece of fungus. He says, "Wow, you got 3. It's just fun. Kalchaka, when he is overtly cute, I don't appreciate as much, but this kind of humor is where he really shines for me.
Yeah. Well, the email jokes and the social media jokes that run throughout this book are hilarious. I like the what is it? The story Redemption, where a taller fungus, which is kind of stretching itself into the sunlight, ends up meeting these more kind of globular fungi on the ground who are the Winklemoss twins, and they're his Facebook friends, and they also invent Bitcoin. Nice, which is, again, a nice commentary on the Winklevoss twins.
Yeah,
and
when they defriend him, they bite him.
Yeah, that's right. And and so some of the stuff with email and so on comes back later as well. So this book made me laugh out loud several times.
Yeah. Another one I really enjoyed is Anne Emon's Debbie's Inferno.
Okay, yeah.
And this is, as one might expect from the title, a comics version, very loose, of Dante's Inferno. And so it begins with the main character, I guess Debbie, who is sitting in bed, eating potato chips, watching television, really not doing much with her life. And all of a sudden her cat starts talking with her and says that we've got to move because the room is filling up with what seems to be water, but it's not really water, and they go on a journey. Mm-hmm. So, and it becomes Dante-esque. Again, we want to thank both Jared Smith and Box Brown for sending us all of the books. Thank you very much for all of them and for introducing us to what seems to be almost everything that Retrofit and Big Planet has come out with. So we discussed Drawn Onward by Matt Madden, Mowgli's Mirror by Olivier Schwarven, Piggy by Niv Babarsky, The Unmentionables by Jack Teagle, Sea Urchin from Laura Netzger, and Entity Observes All Things from Box Brown himself, and the most recent release, Ink for Beginners, from Kate Leth, as well as others that we've discussed here or there. So a lot of titles from Retrofit Big Planet. And again, if you want to find out more about what these guys do, please go to their website, which is, retrofitcomics.com and bigplanetcomics.com.
Yeah, and if you like what you heard about today, it's even worth considering going their subscription route, where you can not only get the 7 books that we just focused on, but several others to come.
Exactly. But, another place where listeners can pre-order these books from Retrofit Comics and Big Planet Comics is through our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. So if you go to their website, dcbservice.com, you can see whenever they solicit one of the Retrofit Big Planet books, you can get a good discount from those guys. Discount Comic Books Service is the best place to get your comics, hands down, and we know because we use them. And after you do get your comics there, Retrofit, Big Planet, and otherwise, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find on the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your desktop computer or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to do. Or if you like to do it the old-fashioned way, you can call us on the phone. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And you can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to our blog. Our Twitter feed is at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and on Google+. We also have a YouTube channel, so check that out. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us, find out what we're doing, and let us know how we're doing.
Yes, and as we said at the top of the show, we really would appreciate it if you would leave us an iTunes rating and review, or even a Stitcher ratings and review. We'd appreciate that.
Yep.
Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.
This has been a Film Waste presentation, darling.